Always good to get the take of Daniel Shaw, Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York, who joins us live now. Hi, Danny. So Meta has blocked posts promoting anti-government protests in Brazil. Should they be doing that?
Greetings, Union. I think your prior analysts were correct to point out the hypocrisy of Meta, of Facebook, of Twitter, of social media, which U.S. imperialism has used at times to fuel rebellion, whether it was in China or Iran. Now they've defined what's happening in Brazil as a violating event. It was a very bloody confrontation yesterday. These were coup mongers, very reminiscent of January 6th here in the United States. They invaded 3 principal government buildings in Brasilia, destroying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property in the Supreme Court, in the Presidential Palace, Planalto, and in the congressional chambers.
What's your take on the West's reaction to these protests? Why, for instance, is the White House so convinced that the protests in Venezuela, if we take that country for one, are good, but the protests in Brazil now are bad?
No question, if this was Cuba or Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, or Zimbabwe, or China, all of the U.S. and the full gamut of social media and the mainstream media would be celebrating and promoting this uprising. But right now, no one wants to take responsibility for what happened in Brasilia about 24 hours ago. Trump has remained silent. Bolsonaro himself has condemned this invasion of Brasilia. Steve Bannon in Breitbart is the only news network to this point that has sided with these coup mongers, with what they would have called in the United States the insurrectionists. And I think it's important to highlight the display of hypocrisy from the Brazilian state, from the Brazilian military and police, who treated these protesters with kids' gloves. And it's important to ask if this was coming from the left wing, if this was coming from the 115 million Afro-Brazilians, if this was coming from the marginalized segments of society, how would the militarized police have reacted yesterday? Surely there would have been a bloodbath, and today you'd be interviewing me about the casualties in Brasilia. But to this point, there hasn't been one casualty. There's been 500 arrests, but really the police have treated these protesters with kids' gloves.
How do you see this situation unfolding?
I think it's going to have a boomerang effect on Bolsonarismo. I think the Bolsonaro camp is more deeply divided than ever. There's going to be full-scale investigations. I think there were more selfies than arms yesterday brought into these 3 government buildings for the upcoming weeks, months, and if the January 6th Commission of U.S. Congress is any precedent for the upcoming years, we're going to see the Brazilian authorities comb through every selfie, every Instagram post, and go after many of these coup mongers who were not, who didn't have a mask over their faces. As we see here in the images and the video reels, how much damage did they do? One protester even defecated in one of the government offices. So I think what we're going to see is a thorough investigation and cleansing and more imprisonment of these far right-wing fascist forces.
Danny, appreciate your time as always. Daniel Shaw, Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York.
Thank you, Union.